Hollywood built the Wild West, you know. But military records, census data, and court cases tell a very different story. Things the studios ignored on purpose because the truth didn't sell tickets. These 25 facts were buried in archives for more than a century, and the last one is going to completely change the date you think the Wild West ended. Stay until the end. Fact 1. The morphine epidemic was the real drug crisis of the Wild West. Let me tell you something Western movies never showed. You probably grew up watching John Wayne, those noon duels, the outlaws, and the sheriffs. But the truth about the Wild West is very different from what Hollywood put on screen. Let's go back to 1865, when the Civil War finally ended. Around 400,000 veterans came home. But many of them didn't come back with just battle scars. They came back addicted to morphine. And why did that happen? Simple. Back then, morphine was the main medicine used for pain on the battlefield. A wounded soldier got shot. The army doctor gave him morphine, and that was how he could handle the pain. The problem is that nobody really understood the power of that substance. When the war ended, those men could no longer live without it. Now think about this. In frontier towns, you could walk into any pharmacy and buy morphine or laudanum without needing any prescription at all. Toothache, back pain, insomnia, any excuse would do. It was sold over the counter, like buying a soda today. Around 1880, the few specialists who studied addiction started noticing something terrifying. In frontier towns, there were more men addicted to morphine than chronic alcoholics. That's right. We always picture the drunk cowboy in the saloon, but the reality is that the silent problem was something else. And here comes the part that might truly shock you. Historians who studied this period estimate that more cowboys died from overdoses and complications from withdrawal than in all those famous shootouts we see in the movies, that good guy reaching for his gun against the outlaw. It happened far less than you think. What really killed these men was a bottle of medicine. It makes sense when you stop and think about it. These veterans carried war wounds, both in their bodies and in their minds. Morphine took the pain away for a few hours, but it came at a price that was far too high. And the strangest part of all is that Hollywood never made a single movie about this. They preferred the duels, the horses, and the heroes. The real drug crisis of the Wild West stayed hidden, forgotten in the pages of books that almost nobody reads. Fact 2. The OK Corral was as narrow as a hallway. Let me tell you something that might change everything you thought you knew about the most famous shootout in the Wild West. That scene you've seen in dozens of movies, with gunslingers staring each other down from far away on a wide, dusty street. It never happened that way. The real confrontation, which took place on October 26, 1881, in the town of Tombstone, Arizona, happened in a tight space. We're talking about a spot around 6 feet wide. Think about that for a second. If you stretched out both arms, you could almost touch both walls at the same time. It was narrower than a lot of kitchens out there. And now comes the part that is truly impressive. In that tiny piece of land, 9 men were packed together. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, alongside Doc Holliday, on one side. On the other, the Clantons and the McClorys. 9 armed men, ready for the worst, in a space the size of a gas station bathroom. The shootout itself lasted about 30 seconds. It was fast, but it was so close, so tight, that something happened that almost nobody talks about. Some of the men felt the gunpowder smoke burning their faces before the bullets even hit them. That is the level of closeness we're talking about. You couldn't miss from far away because there was no far away. Everything was right there in each other's faces. Hollywood took this story and stretched it out. It put the characters in an open street with the sun beating down, dust flying, and that dramatic silence before the first shot. It looked good on screen, I won't deny that, but it was all made up. The truth is much more suffocating and, if you ask me, much scarier. And here's the detail that might make you want to pack your bags. The place still exists. You can visit Tombstone today and walk through it. When people arrive and see the real size of the space, a lot of them are stunned. It looks nothing like what shows up on screen. So here's the question. How many other stories you thought you knew were reshaped to fit on a big screen? Fact 3. The Plains tribes went 10,000 years without horses. Here's something that will probably turn your head upside down. That whole image you saw in Western movies, that native warrior galloping across the plains before 1700, none of that happened that way. And look, this changes everything we think we know about the Wild West. Let me explain. Horses really did exist in North America, that's true, but they disappeared completely about 10,000 years ago. They vanished in the same great extinction that wiped out the mammoths, those giant hairy elephants. For thousands of years, this continent went without a single horse stepping on the ground. Think about that for a second. 10,000 years without horses. Then, around the 1500s, Spanish colonizers brought horses back on the ships that crossed the ocean. That was how the animal set foot on American soil again. But the Spanish kept those herds well guarded, under strict control, far away from native peoples. And this is where the story gets really good. In 1680, the so-called Pueblo Revolt happened in the Southwest. Native peoples rose up against the Spanish, and in the middle of all that chaos, the horse herds spread across the region. Suddenly, these animals were loose, available, within reach of the tribes. Now pay attention to what came next, because it's impressive. Tribes that had never ridden an animal in their lives, people who had never even put a hand on a horse, learned from scratch. And it wasn't just learning how to ride. In less than 30 years, these tribes became some of the best horsemen the world had ever seen. Incredible mounted warriors, riding as if they had been born on top of those animals. Do the math with me. That whole Plains warrior culture, the one Hollywood turned into legend, the great mounted buffalo hunters, the proud warriors, racing across the horizon, all of that was built in less than 3 decades. It wasn't centuries. It wasn't generation after generation. It was just 30 years. It makes you stop and think, doesn't it? What we imagine as an ancient tradition, passed down from father to son for hundreds of years, was actually born almost overnight. History is almost always very different from what we were told. Fact 4. Deadwood was illegal from start to finish. Every law, every arrest, every sentence. Let me tell you something about Deadwood that will make you look at that town in a very different way. That whole place, it should never have existed. Let's go back to 1875. Gold showed up in the Black Hills, and men from all over dropped everything to chase that fortune. There was just one problem, and it was not a small one. That land did not belong to them. It did not belong to the government. It belonged to the Sioux Nation, guaranteed on paper, in black and white, by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And here comes the part that hits hard. The United States government knew that. The Army knew that. Everyone who needed to know knew. And even so, they just stood there with their arms crossed while prospectors invaded land that was not theirs. It was not an accident. It was a decision. Think about it with me for a second. For 2 whole years, Deadwood had no legal basis to operate. No federal court, no recognized territory, no real law. The town was growing. People were arriving in huge numbers. Businesses were opening everywhere, and none of it had any backing at all in the eyes of the law. Now stop and think about what that really means. Every man convicted of murder during that period, the conviction meant nothing. Every piece of land someone bought, every deed signed, worthless paper. Every business deal closed with a handshake or ink. Deep down, it was worth no more than air. We grew up hearing that Deadwood was the most lawless town in the Wild West. And that is true. But it was not lawless because the people were too tough or because nobody could bring order to the place. It was lawless because the government itself deliberately turned its back. They simply let it happen, pretending they did not see it. They turned their backs on a treaty they themselves had signed. They let an entire town be born on top of a broken promise. And the men who went there looking for fortune? They were living in a place that, by law, was nothing more than a ghost. It makes you wonder how many other stories we learned were cleaned up and dressed up to look better than they really were. Fact 5. Tombstone didn't die by bullet. It drowned. Listen to this. Everybody thinks Tombstone came to an end because of shootouts, outlaws, and gunslinger fights. But the truth is very different from what Western movies showed out there. What killed the town wasn't any gun. It was water. Let me explain how this happened. Tombstone grew out of nothing because of silver. Men came from everywhere chasing luck, digging deeper and deeper into those mines. And the deeper they went, the closer they got to a problem nobody knew how to solve. In 1886, what a lot of people feared finally happened. The mines under the town started filling with water. An underground water table down below simply flooded everything. The tunnels filled up, the work stopped. They had pumps to get the water out, of course, but the pumps couldn't keep up. One caught fire, another broke down, and the water kept rising without mercy. Now, look at the size of the mess. The men who ran the town raised more than $600,000 to fix it. Bring that to today, and you're talking about around $18 million. A fortune. The kind of money that would make anyone think twice. And guess what? It did no good. All that money went down the drain, no pun intended. The pumps failed again. The water won the fight. Then came what always happens when the work dries up. People left. And not slowly, either. In less than a year and a half, 3 out of every 4 residents packed their bags and vanished. 75% of the town evaporated. Empty houses, empty streets, closed businesses. Really think about what that means. The same town where the Earp brothers went down in history, where that famous shootout at the OK Corral happened. The same town that became a Wild West legend. It wasn't the Cowboys gang that brought it down. It wasn't politics. It wasn't a fight over territory. It wasn't gunslinger revenge. It was water. Ordinary water. Coming up from the ground that no man could hold back no matter how hard he tried. And here's the part I want you to understand. Those shootouts that became famous, in the end, they were almost a spectacle compared to what really mattered. Noise, smoke, street fights, a one-day thing. The flood was the real blow. Silent, slow, with no glory at all. While everyone remembers the bullets, it was the water that brought the curtain down on Tombstone for good. Sometimes history is just like that. What becomes legend is not what actually ends the story. Fact 6. The Daltons tried to rob the town where they were raised. Let me tell you a story that sounds like something out of a movie, but it really happened. It was October 5th, 1892. An ordinary morning in Coffeyville, a little town in Kansas. And it was right there that the Dalton brothers decided to do something no one before them had dared to try. Rob 2 banks at the same time, on the same day, in the same town. There was just one problem. Coffeyville wasn't just any town to them. It was the place where they had been raised. The people there knew those men's faces. They had watched the Daltons grow up, had sat next to them in church on Sundays, had talked to them on the street. And that's where things start to get interesting. The Daltons thought a simple disguise, some fake beards, a hat pulled down low, would be enough to fool their childhood neighbors. It wasn't. As soon as they got off their horses and walked toward the banks, someone in the street recognized those men. And then the news spread fast. While the gang went into the banks to take the money, the townspeople did something the outlaws never expected. They ran to the hardware store, grabbed rifles and shotguns off the shelves, and took positions at the windows and doors. They weren't police officers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, ordinary men. But that was their town, and nobody was going to rob it without a fight. When the Daltons came out with the bags of money, they walked right into an ambush. The gunfight began. And look at what's impressive. It lasted only 4 minutes. 4 minutes. But that was enough time to turn it into one of the bloodiest scenes in the entire Wild West. When the dust settled, 4 of the outlaws were dead, lying right there in the dirt street. 4 townspeople also lost their lives defending what was theirs. One of the Dalton brothers survived wounded and ended up arrested. It went down in history as the deadliest robbery in the Wild West. And the strangest part is the reason everything went wrong. The Daltons had spent years robbing trains and banks from people they had never seen in their lives, strangers who didn't know who they were. But that day, arrogance got the best of them. They thought they could go back home and rob the very people who had known them since they were kids. The problem is that when you rob strangers, nobody knows your name. When you try to rob your own town, everybody knows exactly who you are. And that was exactly what brought them down. Fact 7. Baseball, not shootouts, was the real passion of the Wild West. Forget for a minute everything you've seen in the movies. That image of the cowboy drawing his revolver at high noon in the middle of a dusty street. It did exist, yes, but it was rare. What really drove those little towns in the American West was something very different, and you've probably never heard about it. Let's go back to 1882. Back then, almost every cattle town in the West had its own baseball team. That's right. While the cattle rested and the cowboys got a break between one long drive and the next, they picked up the bat and the ball. That was how the guys passed the time. It wasn't just some late afternoon game for fun. They took it seriously. Mining companies, the ones that employed hundreds of men digging for gold and silver, formed their own leagues. The workers competed against each other, town against town, company against company, and there was real rivalry, the kind that made people bet money and yell from the stands. Take Dodge City, Kansas, for example. That town became famous in books and movies as one of the most dangerous places on the frontier. Well, Dodge City had an organized baseball team with real uniforms. And look who, according to reports, also took the field: Wyatt Earp. The same Wyatt Earp we know from the stories of the tough sheriff played out there in the outfield, chasing the ball like any other player. Now comes the part that might surprise you the most. In 1886, a mining town in Colorado called Leadville had a team, the Leadville Blues. And this team didn't play on just any empty lot. They had a real stadium with room for 3,000 people sitting down to watch the game. Think about that for a second. 3,000 people in the middle of the Colorado mountains, gathering to watch a ball game. And this is where it gets interesting. No Western movie you've ever seen showed this, not a single one. Hollywood made a choice. It preferred duels, gunpowder, and blood. It looked more exciting on the big screen, right? It sold more tickets. But real life went another way. The true obsession of those people wasn't in a gun holster. It was on the baseball diamond. The story they told us was the shootout. But the real story chose baseball. Fact 8. The U.S. Army ordered the destruction of the bison. Let me tell you something most people never learned in school. Around 1800, nobody knew for sure how many bison there were on the Great Plains. Estimates put the number somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals. There were so many that entire herds took days to pass through the same spot. The ground shook when they moved. To anyone who saw it, it seemed impossible that they could ever disappear, but they did disappear, and fast. In 1889, less than a century later, a survey went looking for these animals across the territory. Guess how many they found? Just 325. I'm not talking about thousands. 325 living bison, left from tens of millions. And here comes the part that makes you stop and think this was no accident. It wasn't disease or drought or some twist of fate. General Philip Sheridan, one of the most powerful men in the Army at the time, left behind in official documents what was really behind it. He understood that bison were the foundation of everything for the Plains tribes. They were food, clothing, shelter, the entire way of life for those people. So Sheridan backed a cold and direct idea. Wiping out the bison was the fastest way to wipe out native resistance. No bison, no food. No food, no fight. And that is exactly what they did. Professional hunters started arriving on the plains. These were not men hunting to eat. They were hunters working on an industrial scale, many of them killing 250 bison in a single day. Repeat that day after day, month after month, with hundreds of hunters spread out everywhere, and you start to understand how a gigantic number of animals disappeared so quickly. And the Army did not just sit there watching. Quite the opposite. The military forces supplied ammunition to those hunters. They provided logistical support, helped with transportation, and offered protection against attacks from the peoples who depended on those animals. In other words, this was not just allowed. It was organized, supported, and funded as part of a government decision. The end of the bison on the Great Plains was not a natural tragedy. It was a planned strategy, carried out on purpose to strike a people through their stomachs. And few Americans today know that this story happened right under the country's own nose. Fact 9. Dodge City had fewer murders than Baltimore has today. Here's something that will probably surprise you. That image of shootouts on Main Street every 5 minutes, pure Hollywood invention. Let's look at the real numbers. At the height of its reputation as a dangerous town, Dodge City recorded, on average, only 1.5 homicides per year. That's right, per year. And Tombstone, that town famous for the shootout at the OK Corral, less than 1 murder per year. Now get ready for the most impressive figure. In 878, the entire territory of Kansas, a huge area, had fewer murders for the whole year than the city of Baltimore, Maryland. Records in a single week today. 1 week. Think about that for a moment. The person who gathered all this information was a historian named Robert Dykstra. He did work no one had done before. He went after every death certificate, every official death record in the 5 cattle towns considered the most violent on the entire American frontier. Towns that stayed in our memory as places where life was worth nothing. And what did he find? That adding up 5 whole years of deaths in those 5 towns combined, the total was still lower than the average for a single month in any major city in the United States today. So where did all that violence we saw in the movies come from? Simple. Movie studios took reality and multiplied it by 100. That's right, by 100 times. That bloody Wild West that grew in our heads, with high noon duels and bodies on every corner, existed much more on screen than on the dusty streets of that time. The truth is that most people living in those towns lived a much quieter life than we imagine. They worked, raised their families, and took care of cattle. Shootouts were the rare exception, not the rule of everyday life. Makes you rethink everything you learned, doesn't it? Fact 10. Nobody knows what the fifth card in the dead man's hand was. Let me tell you something that will make you look at Wild West history in a different way. It was August hour '86 in the town of Deadwood. Wild Bill Hickok, one of the best-known gunslingers of that time, was sitting at a poker table in the saloon. And here's the first detail a lot of people forget. Bill had a habit of always sitting with his back to the wall. He never turned his back to the door. But that day, for some reason, his usual seat was taken, so he sat with his back to the entrance. It was the last mistake of his life. A man named Jack McCall walked in, came up from behind, and shot Hickok in the back of the head. No warning, no chance. Bill fell right there, and in his hands he was holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights, all black clubs and spades. That combination became known forever as the dead man's hand. That part is true. It's in the records. But now pay attention, because this is where things get interesting. A poker hand has 5 cards. Everybody knows what 4 of them were, and the 5th, nobody has any idea. No witness in that saloon wrote down what it was. No document from the time recorded it. It simply vanished from history as if it had never existed. And there's more. You've heard the phrase, dead man's hand, your whole life, right? In Western movies, in card games, in bar conversations. Well, that name didn't even exist when Hickok died. The person who came up with the term was a writer named Frank Wilstash, and he only did it in 1926, 50 years after the shot, half a century. So think about it with me. Every time you see someone in a movie show, that 5th card, every time it appears in a photo or a painting, that is pure invention. Somebody guessed. Nobody truly knows what was there. The most famous hand of cards in gambling history, the one that became a legend, the one every man who has ever played poker knows by name, is still incomplete today. And it will probably stay that way forever. Sometimes the biggest legends are made precisely from what we will never discover. Fact 12. Lightning killed more cowboys than bullets. Here's something you were probably never told about the Wild West. Forget the high noon duels and saloon shootouts. The real killer on the plains didn't carry a revolver. It came from the sky. Think about it. On an open plain, with no trees, no buildings, a man on top of a horse is the highest point for miles around. And when those late afternoon storms formed over the prairies, that cowboy basically became a human lightning rod. The records from the great cattle drives tell a story that goes against everything the movies taught us. During those trips, lightning killed more cowboys than shootouts, cattle stampedes, and snake bites combined. That's right, the sky took more men than any gunslinger ever did. And there's something else that will surprise you. What do you think was the most dangerous job in the West in the 1870s? The outlaw, the sheriff, the card player? None of that. It was the trail cook. It makes sense when you stop and think about it. That man spent the day beside a metal wagon and a heavy cast iron stove, all of it sitting in the middle of an open field, right when the afternoon storms rolled in. He was surrounded by the best conductors of electricity there were, with nowhere to run. The most experienced cowboys learned that lesson the hardest way. by watching their friends die. That's why they created a rule they followed to the letter. At the first crack of thunder, they threw themselves on the ground, stayed as low as possible, and let the horses loose. Why let the horses loose? Because the animal, being tall and wet, attracted lightning. Staying near it was signing your own death sentence. Better to let the horse go and pray the storm passed. It's strange to think about. We grew up hearing that those men were tough because of the bullets they faced, but the truth is that many of them feared a loaded cloud on the horizon more than any armed enemy. In the end, the Wild West was dangerous in a very different way from what Hollywood sold us. And sometimes a man's greatest enemy wasn't another man. It was nature itself, waiting for the right moment to strike from above. Fact 13. The Pony Express was a financial disaster that lasted only 19 months. Think about everything you've ever seen about the Pony Express in movies: riders galloping across the desert, letters crossing the country at the speed of the wind, heroes facing storms and danger. Hollywood took this story and turned it into one of the great adventures of the Wild West. But here's something you may have never heard. Behind all that legend, the Pony Express was one of the biggest financial failures in American history. Let me tell you how things really happened. The service began in April 1860. The idea was bold for the time. Deliver mail between Missouri and California at a speed never seen before, using a line of riders who took turns day and night, stopping only long enough to change horses. And look, the guys who rode were real men. Brave, tough, willing to risk their own skin to carry a letter from one side of the country to the other. The problem wasn't the men, it was the numbers. The business never made a profit, not even close. When they shut it down in October 1861, the company had lost more than $200,000. To give you an idea, that would be somewhere around $6 million today. A fortune thrown away in just over a year and a half. And what was the final blow? Technology. While the riders were sweating their way across mountains and deserts, engineers were stretching telegraph wires across the country. The moment the transcontinental telegraph line was completed, a message that once took days to arrive started traveling in seconds. Overnight, the Pony Express became a thing of the past. Nobody needed a sweaty horse anymore when all it took was pressing a button. The three men behind it all, William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell, paid dearly for that bet. All of them ended up broke. Their dream of revolutionizing communication collapsed along with the bills that would not add up. So the next time you see that romantic image of the lone rider crossing the frontier, remember, behind the legend, there is a much less glorious truth. The Pony Express lasted exactly 19 months. It was fast, it was bold, and it was a huge money pit. History usually keeps only the pretty part. But the facts, when we look closely, tell a very different story. Fact 14. Thousands of mail-order brides arrived and found out it was all lies. Imagine selling everything you own, getting on a train for weeks at a time, crossing half the country, and arriving only to find out that the man waiting for you had lied about every word he wrote. That is exactly what happened to thousands of women in the Wild West. Let's go back to the 1860s. Back then, the American West was full of men and short on women. Guys went out there looking for land, gold, and a new life. But they ended up alone with no one to share the farm or the cabin with. That's when newspapers came up with a solution: Lonely Hearts columns. It worked more or less like today's dating apps, only on paper. A man paid to publish an ad saying he was looking for a wife, and the letters started coming in. And look, a lot of people answered. Women from big cities in the East, tired of a hard life, widows with no future, young women with no prospects for marriage. They all saw it as a chance to start over. They exchanged letters for months, made plans, fell in love with pretty words on paper. Then they gathered their courage, sold their belongings, and hit the road toward a man they had never seen. This is where things fell apart. Many of these grooms had made everything up. They claimed to own large farms when they did not have a single patch of land. They talked about full bank accounts when they barely had enough to eat. And worst of all, some were already married and only wanted a free maid, or something worse. The woman would arrive after weeks of travel and come face to face with the raw, naked reality. And now think about her situation. She had nowhere to go back to. She had already sold everything. She had no money for the trip back. There was no law to protect her, no refund, no one to complain to. She was trapped in a strange land, in the middle of nowhere, with a stranger who had already deceived her. Some accepted their fate and stayed. Others ran away without knowing where to go. And many simply disappeared from the pages of history. That romantic image of the mail-order bride that movies like to show hid one of the biggest scams that went on in the West for decades. It was not romance at all. For many of these women, it was a trap set with ink and paper. Makes you stop and think, doesn't it? In a time with no phone and no way to confirm anything, trust was all these women had. And that trust was exactly what so many men used against them. Fact 15. The owner of the gold land died without a penny. Imagine this. You own the land where the greatest treasure in American history is found. You should end up richer than any king. But the exact opposite happens. This is the story of John Sutter, and it will make you rethink everything about luck and fortune. Sutter was a Swiss immigrant who built a real empire from scratch in the Sacramento Valley, California. We're talking about thousands of acres of land, cattle grazing everywhere, crops, buildings, a small town that carried his name. The man had everything organized. Then came January 1848. One of his employees, named James Marshall, was building a sawmill near the river when he noticed some shiny pieces in the water. It was gold, and not just a little. Marshall brought the discovery to Sutter, and the two of them tried to keep it a secret. It didn't work. The news spread like wildfire. What happened next was something nobody expected. Instead of making the owner of the land rich, the gold rush simply crushed him. Thousands of prospectors came from every corner of the country and the world. They invaded Sutter's land without asking anyone for permission. They slaughtered his cattle for food. They destroyed the buildings. Every piece of ground became a camp for strangers trying to get rich. And here's the part that hurts. Sutter could not do anything. You would think the law would be on his side, right? Wrong. The courts were completely overwhelmed, and the government had no interest at all in protecting one single farmer against a crowd. The man watched his empire disappear before his own eyes, piece by piece, and nobody lifted a finger to help. Sutter spent the next 32 years of his life knocking on Congress's door, asking for compensation for everything he had lost. Year after year, he kept pushing. Year after year, he got empty promises. The money never came, not 1 cent. In June 1880, John Sutter died alone in a cheap hotel room in Washington, completely broke. The man whose land started the greatest gold rush in American history died with absolutely nothing in his pocket. Think about that for a moment. While thousands built fortunes with the gold pulled from his ground, the actual owner of the land ended his days in total misery. Sometimes history has a cruel way of reminding us that being in the right place does not mean luck will be on your side. Fact 15. The owner of the gold land died without a penny. Imagine this. You own the land where the greatest treasure in American history is found. You should end up richer than any king, but the exact opposite happens. This is the story of John Sutter, and it will make you rethink everything about luck and fortune. Sutter was a Swiss immigrant who built a real empire from scratch in the Sacramento Valley, California. We're talking about thousands of acres of land, cattle grazing everywhere, crops, buildings, a small town that carried his name. The man had everything organized. Then came January 848. One of his employees, named James Marshall, was building a sawmill near the river when he noticed some shiny pieces in the water. It was gold, and not just a little. Marshall brought the discovery to Sutter, and the two of them tried to keep it a secret. It didn't work. The news spread like wildfire. What happened next was something nobody expected. Instead of making the owner of the land rich, the gold rush simply crushed him. Thousands of prospectors came from every corner of the country and the world. They invaded Sutter's land without asking anyone for permission. They slaughtered his cattle for food. They destroyed the buildings. Every piece of ground became a camp for strangers trying to get rich. And here's the part that hurts. Sutter could not do anything. You would think the law would be on his side, right? Wrong. The courts were completely overwhelmed, and the government had no interest at all in protecting one single farmer against a crowd. The man watched his empire disappear before his own eyes, piece by piece, and nobody lifted a finger to help. Sutter spent the next 32 years of his life knocking on Congress's door, asking for compensation for everything he had lost. Year after year, he kept pushing. Year after year, he got empty promises. The money never came, not 1 cent. In June 1880, John Sutter died alone in a cheap hotel room in Washington, completely broke. The man whose land started the greatest gold rush in American history died with absolutely nothing in his pocket. Think about that for a moment. While thousands built fortunes with the gold pulled from his ground, the actual owner of the land ended his days in total misery. Sometimes history has a cruel way of reminding us that being in the right place does not mean luck will be on your side. Fact 16. 30 to 40% of Wild West men lived under fake names. Imagine arriving in a new town where nobody knows who you really are. No past, no debts to pay, no one knocking on your door. For many men in the 19th century, that was not some distant dream. It was exactly what the American frontier offered. Here is something most people have never heard about. When researchers went through the old census records from frontier towns, they found something curious. Between 30 and 40% of adult men gave census takers names that simply did not match any previous document. Nothing. No birth record, no official paper, no clue to who they had been before. Who were these people? Well, the list is long. Soldiers who had deserted the army, criminals running from the law, men who already had a wife in one state and got married again in another, and many who had simply left mountains of debt behind in the East and decided to start over from scratch. The West had something no other place offered at that time, a real second chance. You could invent a new name, tell a different story, and nobody had any way to check. There was no phone, no database, no way to cross-check information. A man showed up saying his name was John Smith, and John Smith he was. But all that freedom came at a price, and it was not cheap. The price was living in anonymity for the rest of your life. You could never talk about your true past again. You could never look for the family you left behind. Your real name had to die, along with everything you had been before. And here is the part that makes you think. Many famous figures from that time Gunslingers, card players, and yes, even men who wore the sheriff's star on their chest are known today only by nicknames. That's it, a nickname. The names they were born with, the families who raised them, the true stories of where they came from. All of that disappeared. They took those secrets to the grave. Historians try, but in many cases, it is impossible to know who these people really were. So the next time you hear a Wild West story, remember, that man in the photograph with the hat and the revolver on his waist may not have even had that name. And the secret of who he really was, probably no one will ever find out. Fact 17. An outlaw's career lasted only 4 years on average. Here's something probably nobody ever told you about the Wild West. When you think of an outlaw, you picture a tough guy staring down revolver against revolver on Main Street, right? Well, forget that. The reality was much less glorious and much shorter. The historical records that have survived to this day tell a different story. A typical outlaw in the American West had a career that lasted on average only 4.2 years. That's right, 4 years and a few months between the first crime and the end of the line, and the end usually came early. The average age at death or capture was around 25. These men were young, many still basically boys, when it was all over. But here is the part that may surprise you. Most of them did not die the way movies show. They did not fall in high noon duels or in big shootouts with the sheriff. The truth is much less heroic. They died from the cold. They died from hunger. They died from diseases we could cure today with a cheap pill. Think about what it meant to be a fugitive back then. You could not walk into a town without the risk of being recognized. You could not sleep in a hotel, buy food at a store, or ask a doctor for help. So what was left? Hiding out in the middle of nowhere. No roof over your head, no supplies, no medicine. Many spent freezing nights out in the open, with empty stomachs, slowly getting sick until their bodies simply gave up. It was a lonely, hungry, terrifying life, nothing like the legend we know. And that is where a name everyone has heard comes in: Jesse James. He robbed banks and trains for 15 long years before dying at 34. 15 years. Compare that with the average of 4. Jesse James was such an outlier that historians, no matter how hard they look, cannot find anyone truly like him. He was the rare exception in a world where almost everyone else disappeared quickly and was forgotten. And maybe that is exactly why the myth was born. We remember Jesse James precisely because he was different from all the others. The real life of an outlaw was erased from popular memory, replaced by the image of a handful of legendary names. The reality was cold, short, and sad. Jesse James was the exception, and it was that exception that built the legend we still tell today. Fact 18. Opium dens operated legally on Main Street. Let me tell you something most people never learned in school. In 1880, in the city of San Francisco, there were 316 opium dens operating with official licenses. They were not hidden in dark alleys. They were right there with their doors open on the city's busy commercial streets, in the middle of shops and offices. And who went into these places? It was not just the kind of people you imagine. Records from the time show respected lawyers, store owners, politicians, and businessmen calmly going in and out. It was part of the routine. Nobody thought it was strange. Now pay attention to this part, because this is where the story gets interesting. In the 1870s, states began passing the first laws against opium. You probably imagine it was out of concern for people's health, right? Wrong. When you read the text of those laws carefully, you notice something completely different. The laws were made to target one specific group, establishments owned by Chinese people. The language used in those laws criminalized exactly the Chinese method of smoking opium. Meanwhile, opium syrups and tinctures prescribed by doctors to white customers remained completely legal. Nobody was arrested for that. Think carefully about what was happening here. The same substance. The difference was who used it and how they used it. If a Chinese immigrant smoked opium in his den, it was a crime. But if a white citizen took his opium-based medicine, bought at the corner pharmacy, everything was perfectly legal. And this is where we get to the uncomfortable truth. The first drug laws in all of American history were not created to protect anyone. They were born as racial discrimination laws, carefully disguised as public health policy. That is how it all started in this country. And understanding that origin changes the way we see a lot of what came later. Fact 19. Scalp bounties were created by Europeans, not native people. Think about what you learned in school about the Wild West. I bet the image of scalping was always connected to Native Americans, right? Well, that is exactly where the story they told you has a huge hole in it. Let me take you back to the year 1694 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Colonial authorities did something that rarely makes it into the books. They passed an official law. That law promised payment in silver to anyone who brought in the scalp of a Native American. This was not some isolated act by a random man out in the woods. It was government policy, written, signed, and put into action. Now stop and think for a second. A government putting a price on people's heads, literally turning human beings into money. And it was not just the English. The French did it. The Dutch did it too. Each of those governments, at different times, set up its own scalp bounty program. It was a system, almost like a business. And here comes the part that usually blows people's minds when they hear it for the first time. Many tribes only began practicing scalping on a large scale after Europeans turned it into a commodity. When there is payment involved, things change. What had once been rare or had a different meaning became something driven by money, encouraged by those in power. In other words, the practice that Hollywood placed on Native Americans, showing it in movie after movie as if it had always been their thing, was actually encouraged and spread by the colonizers themselves. They created the demand. They paid for it. They industrialized something terrible. And the most ironic detail of all, those same colonizers who offered silver for scalps were later the ones who condemned the practice and pointed the finger at Native people. They erased their own fingerprints from this story. This shows something important about how history reaches us. The people who write the books usually write them in the way that suits them, and the details that put the winner in a bad light tend to disappear over time. The next time you watch a Western on television, remember that fact from 1694. Remember who really put a price on another human being's head. Because the version we were handed for decades was far from telling the whole story. Fact 20. 78% of Wells Fargo robberies were inside jobs. Let me tell you something that will change the way you see Western movies. Those masked outlaws galloping across the desert to hold up a Wells Fargo stagecoach. The truth is way less glamorous than Hollywood made you believe. The Pinkerton Agency, which was the biggest detective firm of the time, kept the investigation records. Between 1870 and 1884, they analyzed 313 Wells Fargo stagecoach robberies. And what they found will leave your jaw on the floor. In 78% of the cases, there was an insider inside the company itself. Think about it with me. How did a gang of outlaws, know exactly which stagecoach was carrying the gold. How did they know the exact departure time, the chosen route, and where the cargo was hidden inside the vehicle? The answer is simple. Someone on the inside told them everything. It was an employee angry about his pay. It was the station agent passing along the schedules. It was a company contact who knew the exact value of what was being transported. These people handed over the details on a silver platter, and the gang outside just carried out the dirty work. In other words, that romantic image of the clever outlaw who beat the system all by himself was, for the most part, pure fiction. What really happened was something else: organized corporate fraud, planned by people who wore suits and worked inside the office. And here's the part that really makes you think. The armed men who appeared on the road, with their faces covered, were often just hired muscle, pawns in a bigger game. The people really pulling the strings were comfortable, far from danger, collecting their share without ever drawing a gun. Wild West crime, in the end, looked a lot more like the corporate scandals we see in newspapers today than the shootout scenes in movies. It was people on the inside betraying the company's trust, using privileged information to line their own pockets. So the next time you watch a Western and see that robbery on the dusty road, remember, the real criminal probably wasn't on horseback. He was sitting behind a desk, pen in hand, calmly planning the whole thing. Fact 21. The women who owned the West, and nobody told you. Let me ask you something. When you think of the Wild West, what comes to mind? Probably gunslingers, tough sheriffs, and women waiting to be rescued, right? That is how we grew up seeing it in the movies. But wait until you hear the truth. Let's go back to Kansas, around 1880. Back then, on the frontier, something surprising was happening. About 15% of all land deeds, the legal documents that proved who owned what, were in women's names. That's right. 1 in every 7 properties belonged to a woman. And why did that happen? Well, life on the frontier was hard on men. A lot of people died young. Disease, heavy work accidents, fights that ended in gunfire. In those territories, men fell often. And when that happened, the land passed to their wives, their daughters, their sisters. They inherited the property and took charge. But here comes the part that will make you rethink everything. Many of these women were not born rich, far from it. A good number of them arrived in western towns with nothing, working as domestic servants, cooking and cleaning other people's houses. And guess what? Some of those same women retired years later as landowners. With several properties in their names, they built everything from scratch. The historian Julie Roy Jeffrey spent years studying this. She went through court records, the official documents of the time, and found dozens of cases like this, one after another. It was not an exception. It was more common than anyone imagines. So, why have you never heard about this? Why did the movies never show these women? The answer is simple and kind of disappointing. Hollywood had a formula. The studios needed the helpless girl, the damsel in distress, waiting for the hero in the white hat to show up on his horse. It sold tickets. These strong women who managed land and did business better than many men simply did not fit the story they wanted to tell. So they were erased, deleted from the scripts as if they had never existed. But they did exist, and there were many of them. Fact 22. The entire Wild West fit into a space smaller than the state of Indiana. Stop and think for a moment. That shootout at the OK Corral, you've seen dozens of times on screen. The dusty cattle drives passing through Dodge City, the Lincoln County War, the gold rush in Deadwood, the entire life of Billy the Kid, from beginning to end. Now imagine that all of this, every famous story Hollywood turned into legend, happened on a piece of land smaller than the state of Indiana. It sounds like a lie, but it isn't. For more than 100 years, movies sold us an idea. The idea of the Wild West as a giant territory stretching from one end of the country to the other, full of danger around every corner, with gunslingers in every saloon and ambushes on every dirt road. It is a powerful image. The problem is that it simply does not match the facts. When you connect the dots on the map, the real places where these things actually happened, you notice something curious. They were all packed together, a handful of counties, connected to one another, taking up just over 3% of all American territory. And it was not over centuries, as many people imagine. It was a narrow window of about 20 years, one generation, that's it. So, what was happening in the other 97% of the West? The answer may surprise you. Everything was working. There were farms producing food, ranches raising cattle with no drama at all, small towns where people woke up early, went to work, raised their children, and came home at the end of the day. No high noon duels, no bank robberies, nothing worthy of becoming a movie. And here's the irony almost nobody notices. Those places were considered boring, precisely because they worked. Order does not make a good movie scene. Routine does not sell tickets. Nobody wants to watch a farmer planting wheat for 2 hours on the big screen. That is why the camera always pointed at the exception, at the rare case of violence, and never at the quiet rule that dominated real life. That is how a tiny fraction of history, compressed into a handful of counties and just 2 decades, ended up spreading through our imagination as if it were the portrait of an entire continent. The real Wild West was much smaller than you think, and for the most part, much calmer too. The next time you watch a Western, remember this: you are watching the 3%. The other 97% were just living their lives in peace. Fact 23. Buffalo Bill was seen by 50 million people before movies existed. Think about it for a second. Before movie screens existed, before any camera ever filmed a cowboy galloping across the desert, there was already a man putting the Wild West in front of an audience. And it was not a small audience. We're talking about around 50 million people around the world. That's right, 50 million. And this was at a time when nobody had a television at home. His name was William Cody, but everybody knew him as Buffalo Bill. The show he created, Wild West, ran non-stop for 30 years. It was not one season. It was not one summer. It was 3 decades of taking from city to city a living version of what the country had just left behind. And the size of this thing was enough to leave anyone's jaw on the floor. At its peak, in 1893, the same year Chicago hosted the Great World's Columbian Exposition, the show put on 318 performances in a single season. Just to give you an idea, it made more money than any stage play in all of America at that moment. Nobody beat Buffalo Bill at the box office. Now imagine the logistics. The show employed 640 people and took no fewer than 500 horses on the road. There were real bison walking through the arena. There were staged stagecoach attacks with gunfire, dust, and chaos. And there were Native American performers taking part in the spectacle, showing the public something most people had never seen up close in their lives. But here is the part a lot of people do not realize. Buffalo Bill did not just live the real Wild West. He fought, hunted, and worked on that land. The smartest thing he did was something else. He took all of that and turned it into a brand, into a product people wanted to pay to see. He created the image of the cowboy, the Indian, the wild frontier, the way it became stamped in everyone's mind. And that is why this matters so much. When Hollywood finally started making the first Westerns, filmmakers did not invent anything from scratch. They copied. They copied the way Cody staged the scenes, the hero, the villain, the shootout, the atmosphere. Every cowboy movie you have ever watched in your life drank from that well, directly or indirectly. So the next time a Western comes on screen, remember the name. William Cody, Buffalo Bill, was the man who sold the Wild West to the world before the camera even learned how to tell that story. Fact 24. Cowboy boots were a symbol of debt, not freedom. Think of the classic image of the American cowboy, that tough guy riding across the plains, free as the wind, with his shiny leather boots. It looks like the face of independence, right? Well, the truth behind those boots is very different from what Hollywood sold us. Let's get to the facts. In 1875, a pair of custom-made cowboy boots cost between $15 and $20. That may sound like little today, but back then, it was a small fortune. A cowboy working the cattle trails made around $25 a month. In other words, that pair of boots was worth 2, sometimes 3 months of hard work. We're talking about a whole paycheck just to put something on his feet. And this is where the story gets interesting. Most of these men did not have that money saved up. So they did what a lot of people still do today. They bought on credit. The boots came from the company store owned by the very company they worked for. And the payment? Taken straight out of their wages. The cowboy put up his own pay as collateral and spent the entire season working to pay off the very thing he was wearing. Notice what that means. The man bought the boots before even starting his first day of work and only finished paying for them on the last. The work season started with debt and ended with the debt paid off. If he decided to quit the job halfway through, he still owed money for the footwear. It was a smart way for companies to keep men tied to the job, even without chains. So that romantic figure we grew up seeing in movies, the lonely cowboy galloping free across the horizon, had one detail nobody talked about. The boots on his feet usually were not really his yet. In practice, they belonged to the company store until the last cent was paid. It is funny how a symbol can fool you. Cowboy boots became a symbol of freedom, of an untamed spirit, of a life with no strings attached. But the reality was the opposite. For most of those men, every step taken in those boots was a silent reminder of the debt they carried. It was not freedom, it was commitment, obligation, hard work to pay off a bill. The next time you watch a Western and admire those boots, remember, the man wearing them was probably working hard just to be able to call them his own. The freedom of the frontier, in the end, often came with the price tag still hanging. Fact 25. The last stagecoach robbery was in 1916, not 1890. Here's something that will probably surprise you. When you think of the Wild West, you picture cowboys, gunslingers, and stagecoaches being robbed on dusty roads. And in your mind, all of that ended sometime around the 1890s, right? That is what the movies always told us. But the truth is very different and a lot more interesting. The last confirmed stagecoach robbery in the United States did not happen in the 19th century. It happened on December 5th, 1916, in the state of Nevada. That's right, 1916. To give you an idea, by then, automobiles were already driving through cities, telephones were already in homes, and World War I was happening in Europe. And even so, out there in the middle of the American desert, someone was still stopping a stagecoach to rob it, the classic way. And there's more. The last great cattle drive. Those long journeys cowboys made while moving herds for hundreds of miles happened in 1940 in Arizona. Can you imagine? While Western movies were already being made in Hollywood, showing a world that had supposedly ended, real cowboys were still out there doing exactly what the screen said was a thing of the past. and the last person imprisoned for crimes committed during that classic Wild West era? He died in a federal penitentiary in 1955. We're talking about someone who lived long enough to see television arrive in American homes. So where did this idea that the Wild West ended in 1890 come from? The answer is simpler than it seems. In 1890, the American census made an official statement saying that the frontier was closed, meaning there were no longer large areas of unoccupied land left to settle. That was all. A note in a government document, a matter of statistics, not reality. But historians took that date and turned it into a marker. Hollywood came later and adopted it all as absolute truth. And that is how it got burned into our memory, that that world ended suddenly, as if someone had turned off a light. The truth is that the practices, the economies, and even the violence of the Wild West continued for more than half a century after the movies decided the story was over. The real world does not follow a movie script. It just keeps going, stubbornly, long after everyone thinks the chapter has already been closed.